this is like halfway through 6.2. We'll talk about 6.2 and 6.3 and then get started on the POGL. So when we're talking about survivorship curves, this is graphing the two variables of the log of survivorship, which is essentially how long something lives. It is a logarithmic calculation, so you're never going to be asked to draw one of these. You might just be asked questions about interpreting it, okay? But it's looking at age and how many of the organisms survive, and then this is looking at the total age. So the older things get, the fewer things are surviving. That's true with all three types of curves, because things can die of old age, regardless of other things going on in the environment. So when we're looking at survivorship curves and we're looking at different types of populations and species, one of the questions is what affects the birth rate? So another way to say that is natality. I think that's an interesting word. So if you think neonatal or like prenatal vitamins, something that I'm thinking of because I've had those before, that's talking about birth. So natality is birth rate, or looking at how often things are born. Mortality, what's that about? Death. Okay, so what's the death rate, right? Factors that regulate those different things can fit into a couple of categories. So they can be extrinsic or intrinsic. Do you know the difference between that?
Extreme and normal?
No. Fair guess, though. Exterior versus interior. What's that mean?
Outside, inside.
Okay, so extrinsic is also outside. Intrinsic is inside. And you have this same thing in your life when you're talking about motivation. You can have extrinsic motivation or intrinsic motivation. So you can want to do something because you think it's better for yourself, it's something that you really enjoy, or it's a personal challenge. That's intrinsic. If it's extrinsic, maybe you get good grades because for every A you get $100. Or if you don't get a good grade, your parents will whoop your butt and ground you for life. Like, that's an extrinsic motivation, right? So extrinsic is something that comes from outside of the species. Intrinsic would be something within the species. So if a species is competing within itself, that's an intrinsic factor. If a population has disease introduced to it, that's an extrinsic factor. Okay, so extrinsic and intrinsic. Biotic or abiotic, you should remember the difference between those.
Just like alive or not.
Right, so give me an example of a biotic factor that could affect a group of organisms. Something that's alive that could affect their population.
Like other alive things?
Yeah,
Animals?
other things. So you can have competition, predators, right? Okay, that's biotic. What about something that's abiotic?
That'd be sunlight.
Is it like the
Sunlight, yeah. What else? Kathleen, what did you say?
Weather? The weather?
Weather, okay, so maybe there's a drought, maybe there's a flood, okay, those things are abiotic, there's nothing living, but if an area floods and it kills everything off, that's a factor that's affected their mortality, okay? Density dependent or independent, I talked about that yesterday. What was the difference between those?
Someone else do.
I think factors that vary depending on population density is density dependent, and those that do not is density independent.
Yeah. So a drought, is that density dependent or density independent?
Independent, right?
Independent, because it's going to affect the population whether there are 100 of them or 10 of them. You could argue that if there are 10 of them, then there's still more water to go around, so there's a little bit of argument there, but most natural disasters are density independent. Okay, what about predation?
Yes.
So there being a predator, density dependent or density independent?
Dependent.
Okay, because if there are more of the species, or if there are more predators, that's density based. You're more likely to run into a bad guy if there are 100 of them than if there are 10 of them, okay, that kind of thing. So a factor can fit into, when you're looking at these three different categories, you can place it in all three of them, okay? But you can just think about things that affect populations with those terms. That's what this section talks about. The next page also talks about things that are density independent versus density dependent. And you should be able to give and identify examples based on those categories that I just talked about. So is it biotic or abiotic? Is it intrinsic or extrinsic? What's that look like? We've talked about these two terms before, intraspecific and interspecific. This is not giving detail. You're a specific person, and it's looking at a species. So intraspecific is within a species. So you can have competition between members in a species. So this would be, there's only 10 girls in the school, and every guy wants to ask the girl out for prom. Okay, you're competing with other guys. Interspecific would be between different species. So there's only 10 girls. You've asked the girl out, but there's only 5 tickets to prom. And you're going to prom at another high school. And there are other people from the other high school trying to buy tickets. Now you're competing with people from the other high school. Okay. The example that they give here, usually when we talk about intraspecific or interspecific, a lot of examples involve bacteria. So when we talk back about ecology and relationships between different organisms, we looked at some examples of bacteria competing with each other versus surviving better when both bacteria were around. So sometimes having another species around helps both populations survive better than if they're on their own. It just depends on how they interact with each other. Okay? Go. Maybe.
Starfish was at the top.
That's a keystone species. And yeah, the keystone species helps regulate things. So when you're looking at this, do you know what these guys are? It's listed right here, so it's kind of obvious. But
Rabbit.
rabbit, it's a hare. It's a hare. And a lynx. A lynx is kind of like a cat. Think like a mountain lion. They're pretty shy, so catching good pictures of them is usually difficult.
Very large house cats.
Very large house
That
cat.
can possibly
Very large house cat. Ooh,
pieces.
if I have time, remind me to show you the savannah cat.
I've seen this, I think. Is it a tiny? It's the most deadly cat in the world.
No,
Has the
no,
highest
just
birth
just
rate, but it's
remind me to show you. It's
super
cool.
tiny.
It's my husband's dream pet, which I think is funny. So when we're looking at this is showing how populations of hares versus lynx have oscillated back and forth. Because when you have a predator hunting a specific prey, lynx hunt hares, the lynx population will get really high, and then a year after that, or a couple years after that, because there are so many lynx, did I say lynx population gets high? Okay. Because there are so many lynx, they hunt all the rabbits. So they're killing the rabbits, and then there's not enough food. So the lynx population dies off, and then the rabbit population takes off because there aren't as many predators. So they're able to grow and reproduce. And then because the rabbit population has gone up, the predator population follows that. So it's this back and forth, which is why the rises and drops look like they follow each other, because of that cause and effect relationship. Okay, so is this particular example intraspecific competition or interspecific competition? Interspecific, because it's predation. Okay, go ahead, Lucas.
How did humans break this chain?
Break what chain?
Like the chain of dying from predators or lack of food,
Oh,
and then coming back. I don't know.
we don't really have predators. There's nothing that hunts humans specifically. Even sharks don't really attack humans, which is why you can scuba dive safely without always being in a cage. Because if you see a shark while you're scuba diving, don't approach it, and it's not gonna approach you.
It's like
Sharks don't usually, it's like bees. Bees don't usually seek out to attack humans. It's just sometimes they sting humans.
I mean, like, long
Don't they
ago,
die after?
how have we broken this chain?
I-
I don't get
That-
what
the-
you're
I-
saying. Like, no
that-
one is going
There's
after us.
never really been any predators, unless you think that humans were around when dinosaurs were around, and even then we don't know if dinosaurs specifically hunted humans. So
Are you asking why there was never anything that hunted us?
Also, that
I don't know.
So an evolutionary biologist would probably talk with you about the fact that we are the most complex thing, evolutionarily speaking. So we are like survival of the fittest kind of organisms. We're kind of at the top of all the food chains because of largely our brains and our ability to think. So we can plan for the future. We know how to survive in different types of environments. whereas animals don't have a choice kind of in how they survive. Either they can or they can't.
Okay, what is that popping?
I don't know. You want to close the door? Yeah. You can totally get the door. Okay, so then last couple of points. The density dependent stuff can be really dramatic. So if locusts are a good example of that. A locust looks kind of like a grasshopper, and every once in a while they swarm. So conditions are just right where they breed and where they start to grow, that you get the ground looks like it's covered with bugs. And then all of a sudden these locusts have eaten all the food where they were born, where they started. They need some place to go, so they all start flying elsewhere. So it looks like a dust storm, but it's locusts. So the density dependent stuff can look astonishing. Another example of this is a swarm, when bees swarm, because you can have a colony of bees swarm as well. So they'll leave the hive that they're in and make a hive somewhere else. It's dangerous when that happens, though. So the locust explosions could be dangerous too, because you have all these bugs flying all over the place. It causes people to run screaming in terror because people don't like bugs. Okay. The two other last factors, and these are usually density dependent, are stress and crowding. So there are actually diseases and symptoms associated with being overcrowded. So this is something that researchers have seen in lab animals, so mice, and a couple of other things that have been tested in the lab. They have enough food and water, so they're not starving, they're not thirsty, but if you're literally living on top of each other, then you're overcrowded, and that causes interesting side effects, like stress and stuff from crowding. So the last section talks about population size and conservation. How do we try to make sure that a population doesn't get hunted to extinction? What's that look like? So, or why does it matter? Okay, so this is a tuna. I didn't realize how big tuna were till this chapter. Like, I knew they were, I don't know, I guess I thought they were like a bass. You could catch them in a lake. No, they're pretty big. Like, that's bigger than me and any of you combined.
Is it? Oh, I thought it was just 50 feet.
I think it depends on the species. So the big eye tuna, well, this is talking about bluefin, but this is a big eye, so there's technically a difference. They used to be bigger. So this says that in the 1980s they were 100 to 160 kilograms, which if you take your weight and divide by 2, that's about how many kilograms you weigh. So if I weigh 140, I'm about 70 kilograms. It's not perfect, it's really 2.2. I'm about 70 kilograms. And they were 100 to 160 kilograms. We're talking big fish. But now they're only about 50 kilograms. So because they're being hunted more, they aren't able to live as long, so they don't grow as big. So what we catch is now smaller than what it used to be. Okay? That's one thing that we can look at if we look at historical data too. So pictures like this are important and helpful for us figuring out how things used to be and how things have changed. So one of the biggest things when we talk about conserving species is that if you live on an island, or if a species is on an island, it's more vulnerable than if it's on a bigger piece of land. So there's this theory called the island biogeography theory. It's talked about here. This particular figure relates to this. So the theory of island biogeography says that the closer the island is to mainland, the more species are introduced to it, so it's colonized more often. And the bigger the island is, the fewer organisms, the fewer species will go extinct. So if the island is bigger and closer to the mainland, it can support more, bigger variety of species, so it should have more biodiversity, and things are less likely to go extinct because there's more area, so there are more resources, there's less competition because of the size of the island, and again, because it's closer to the mainland, things are introduced to it on accident more often, so that gives you more genetic diversity. Okay, so this is an important theory when we're talking about population conservation and sizes. So this diagram or figure helps with that. On the rest of this page, there are a couple of terms that may look familiar from a Bio 1 class. You will talk about these in AP Bio as well, so this is going to be some overlap for those of you in that class. Genetic diversity, genetic drift, and then the founder effect or the bottleneck effect. Those are kind of terms that are interchangeable for the same thing. So when we talk about genetic diversity, we're looking at what genes are in a population. So, for example, in the US, we have type A blood, type B blood, type AB, and type O. So the different alleles, the genes, are an allele for A, an allele for B. When you combine those, you get AB. There's an allele for O. If you take A and O, you have type A blood. If you have two O alleles, you have type O blood. Okay, we have that's a fair mix of diversity, we'll say.
That's only in the U.S.
That's in the U.S. There's actually this other rare type of blood called type H blood, but it's only in like a few islands in, I want to say, Indonesia. So pretty much if you are a person with type H blood and you have major blood loss,
You die.
you're in trouble. Yeah, you die because there's nobody else who has that, so people aren't donating that. So that is pretty sad. But what can you do when people don't have that type of blood?
So H can only go to H, get
Yeah.
H.
My understanding is H can only receive H. I don't know how H blood donated to you or I.
Is it
It's a
kinda like
universal
O?
donor.
Huh?
O is the universal donor.
H is-
And I don't, H can't take type O blood though. I don't know why it's different. I don't know what makes it different.
I guess it
But
is
type H
universal.
blood can only take type H blood.
What about, what's the acceptor? Is it
AB.
AB? Okay, so could AB take H?
I don't think so. Because that's why H can't go to any of them either. So it's a
How did
com-
we get that?
Ah.
That's weird.
I don't know, can we
A
pull that
mutation.
when we see our blood type?
I want to know mine.
If I do that, I'm doing it with my dual credit class. And if I do that and I have enough kits left over, we can do it too if you want. But I don't know if I'm doing it with them.
I want to be B positive.
You can always go donate blood, and then they'll tell you
No,
what
I
blood type
can't.
you have.
I tried to donate and they told me I'm not eligible to because I went outside the country to a country that,
Yeah, you have to travel, and even medications you're on, that can affect things too. And then if you pass out while you're trying to give blood, that kind of invalidates you too. So, yeah, don't pass out, which I almost did. So, okay. The genetic drift is the idea of genes being introduced into a population. So going back to the islands, if you have 10 species of birds on an island, and then the same species is on the mainland or an island nearby, and they occasionally trade individuals from those species, there's genetic drift. The genes from one pool, from one group, enter the new group, which gives you new alleles or new versions of the DNA. So you have genetic drift happening. Okay? Without genetic drift, then you start to get organisms that tend to look all alike. That's the founder effect. If you have a bunch of a species, but only a few of them travel to an island or end up on an island, then what you have left on the island is what's going to reproduce to make that island population. So if most of the alleles from the original colony, the original organisms that came from the mainland, look alike, then most of the individuals on the island will start to look alike. Okay, that can be a problem for a few reasons. This particular section talks about cheetahs as an example. If you look at the DNA of cheetahs, populations that currently exist, male cheetahs look almost genetically identical to each other. So at some point, most of the male cheetahs died off, and there were only a few left. So the ones that were left were the only ones who were able to reproduce. So now all of the male cheetahs' DNA is pretty much the same. For some reason, that doesn't seem to be affecting cheetahs a ton, but scientists think that might have something to do with the fact that cheetahs do have low fertility rates. So they don't have babies very often, whereas other cat species are able to have more offspring more often. So they just seem to be infertile for some reason. There's abnormal sperm, which probably contributes to low fertility rates because the sperm aren't functioning the right way, so they're not able to fertilize the eggs. It's kind of a problem. Okay. And offspring, even when there is fertilization and there are babies born, they die more often than would be expected because they probably have some genetic problems. Okay, so if you only have a small pool where everything is identical, that's like inbreeding, and inbreeding usually has negative effects. Okay, last thing, and yeah, if you think of a good example of that for like history, would be all the royal families that only married each other, and then they had lots of hemophilia, which was the blood disease. If you got cut, you couldn't clot, so you just died. Okay, two other terms. You're like, oh yeah, it's great. Minimum viable population size, and then metapopulation. So, what's viable mean?
Like, possible, yes.
Possible. So the idea of something being viable is it being able to survive or to work out. So if we talk about a baby that's developing in a woman's womb, the baby's not viable until a certain point. So if the baby is miscarried, if the pregnancy ends for some reason, and the baby's born at like 4 months, the baby's not viable. It will not survive. It's just, we don't have science that's able to help that kid develop to be, to survive to adulthood. Babies are viable at about 20 weeks, depending on what hospital you go to.
Grey's Anatomy.
Yeah, that works. Or I have a friend who's expecting twins right now, and she's on bed rest at the hospital because her water started leaking, and she made it past 20 weeks. So the sac around the babies is starting to leak.
Twins.
Yeah.
And it's in the hospital right now, I think.
There you go. I highly doubt that it's your aunt. That
I
your
don't
aunt
know,
though.
not my aunt. I'm really. You sure?
Yeah, her last name's Schaefer. She's closer to my age
I
too,
don't know.
so your aunt's probably not close to my age. Is she?
What's her first name? I don't know.
Hallie.
No.
There you go. Duh, wouldn't that be a small world? Her, now that she's past 20 weeks, every week that she's able to keep the babies is just better for them. They'll have less problems when they're born, but there's a good chance that when they are born, they're going to survive now. Before she passed 20 weeks, there wasn't really good chance of that. Okay, so that viable means being able to survive. A metapopulation is the idea that if you have a bunch of islands that have all the same species, because there's a lot of genetic drift between the different islands, all of those populations on each individual island form a metapopulation. So it's one big conglomerate, kind of big population altogether. So when you look at a metapopulation, there's two different types of areas. There are sources and sinks. So in this example, the sources are these dark purple. Notice all the arrows are drawn away from them. Okay, that means that these populations are bigger and produce extra organisms beyond what can survive on these islands, so they travel to islands nearby. Okay, these light purple ones are sinks because these aren't producing a lot of these species. Maybe the species die off for different reasons. So even though they get new visitors or new individuals of those species, these aren't really producing extra of those species. So they're just a sink for that species. It just keeps like coming there and not surviving for super long or not growing beyond what that island can hold. Okay? So metapopulation, minimum viable population size. If the population gets too small, you can't survive. It would be like if you have bugs, of a specific type of beetle on an island, and all of the male beetles die, you have no viable population anymore. Okay? So how much can the island support? What's the bare minimum? And stopping.